11th, 2003, and this is the beginning of an interview with Dwaine Osborn at 2109 West 38th Street, Marion, Indiana. This is Mr. Osborn, and he is 69 years old and was born on August 21st, 1933. I am Shelby Canterbury. Mr. Osborn is my grandfather. What war did you serve in?
The Korean War.
What was your branch of service?
The U.S. Army.
What was your rank?
Corporal.
Where did you serve?
Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was drafted. I tried to beat the draft and join the Coast Guard. Went to Cincinnati and tried to enlist in the U.S. Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard didn't seem to want to take me in because of a knee problem that I had, but that didn't keep the Army from wanting me.
Were you living at home at the time?
I was living in Marion, Indiana, yes.
Why did you join?
Well, I didn't join, I was drafted.
Why did you pick the branch of service that you joined?
Well, you didn't get a choice there. When I was drafted, all those draftees were in the Army, and that was it.
Do you recall your first days in the service?
Oh, yes. Nobody could forget those first days in the service.
What did it feel like?
Well, I was a young man, and I was lost.
Tell me about your boot camp and training experiences.
Well, I had 16 weeks of armored infantry basic training, which is infantry training basically, but you also do some things in tanks, and anything that you do in tanks is called armored. And so I had 16 weeks of that training.
How did you get through it?
Well, I got through it well. I adapted to the Army well. It just seemed to be kind of a game to me, and I got along fine in the Army.
How many different skills did you have to learn to maintain your position?
Well, after I graduated from basic training, I became an instructor in the armored school at Fort Knox, Kentucky. This was the first time they had attempted to allow anyone except commissioned officers to be instructors in the armored school. And so I had to go through the armored school myself, which was a matter of 12 weeks. And as a student, and then we had a refresher course of 6 more weeks to be sure that we had the speaking skills and everything else that we needed to go along with being instructors at the armored school.
Okay, and which war exactly did you serve in?
This was during the time of the Korean War.
And where did you go?
Well, I didn't go anyplace. At one time I was on orders to go to Germany and be an instructor in the armored school in Germany. However, there was a German man in the company with me in the instructor battalion, and he wanted to go back to Germany, and he made those wishes known, and so he was put on those orders and I was taken off, and so I did my entire military career at Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Do you remember arriving there and what it was like?
Yes, I remember arriving there. I was nervous and scared, and just like every other new recruit into the service is.
What was your job or assignment?
Well, as I said, I was an instructor in the armored school at Fort Knox, Kentucky. This is a very prestigious school for people to attend. We taught everybody that was commissioned officers in the U.S. Army, in the Russian Army, in the German Army, and in the Polish Army.
Did you ever see any combat?
No, I never saw combat.
Did you hear about combat and the casualties in Korea?
Yes, we heard about that, and we had a few casualties of our own due to some inexperienced people that didn't really understand the English language and the instructions that we were giving them at times. One such instance, we were on a range firing the 90 millimeter gun from a tank, and there is a little car that comes down a railroad track, and as it comes down the track, then people are supposed to fire at it and at the range, and then after that's done, then the guns are all cleared. That means there's no ammunition in them. And then there's a little putt-putt that come down the track to tow the car back up the hill so it could be used as a target again. And one of these Russian officers didn't understand the commands that were given to him, and he fired at the putt-putt car, and it was a fairly good shot. He knocked the putt-putt car and the two occupants off of the track, and they were both somewhat injured, not killed or extremely seriously injured, but somewhat injured.
Did you have friends in Korea fighting while you were in the United States?
Yes, I did. I had a lot of friends that went into the Army with me that ended up in Korea, and I communicated with some of them, and they told me about how bad things were in Korea. The heat, the wet ground, the lack of interest in human life that the Korean people had, things that were just not conducive to good morale.
Tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences.
Well, one day we were on the tank range and we were firing 76 millimeter cannons. Normally we fired 90 millimeters, but this time we were firing 76 millimeters from M41 tanks, which is a smaller tank that's a little quicker and a little more nimble, and it's used for reconnoitering, but it also mounts the cannon and some machine guns. And there was a full tank crew and an instructor on the tank. The crew was inside. That encompassed a driver and a bow gunner that sits next to the driver. In the fighting turret, there was a tank commander, a loader, and a gunner. And somehow or another, the loader dropped a round of ammunition, and it went off inside the tank. And as the tank was burning, there were no persons able to get out of the tank, and everybody inside was killed and burned, and rounds were going off that were in the storage area below the floor, and it was probably an hour or longer before we could get the fire out, and it was safe to approach the tank, and at that time there were the loss of 5 lives.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
Yes, I was awarded the Good Conduct Medal and many medals as far as marksmanship were concerned, because we taught many different phases of marksmanship, starting with a .45 caliber handgun, the grease gun, the BAR, the mortar launcher, the bazooka, the .30 caliber machine gun, the .50 caliber machine gun, 76 millimeter tank gun, and 90 millimeter tank gun. And I was awarded marksmanship awards in all of those categories.
Was there a presentation for these awards?
This was simply done at a company level. The company commander would have the company stand at attention, and the awards for the various things would be passed out at that time.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
Well, of course, we had phone calls we could make every now and then. In basic training, we were limited to 1 phone call per week, and that was limited to 5 minutes. And we didn't get to leave the base on the weekend or anything like that, so there was the 1 phone call and daily letters, and that's how we kept in contact.
What was the food like?
The food was something to get used to. It seems as though the cooks in the Army were not cooks that were interested in gourmet meals. They were just interested in meals that were correct for you to eat to get the right kind of nourishment so that you could do the hard work that you had to do, that every soldier has to do in the Army.
What kind of food did you eat?
Well, we had lots and lots of potatoes. We had fried eggs in the morning that weren't really eggs. They were powdered, and sometimes they were blue and a little bit difficult to sit down and eat. And we had the basic things, hamburgers and hot dogs and little squares of ice cream. We had plenty to eat, actually, but it wasn't exactly what you would want to eat.
Did you feel pressure or stress from your day-to-day activities?
Nobody could be in the service without feeling stress, and as I said, I adapted to the service rather well, and even in my basic training company, at first I was advanced to a lance corporal position, which is a fellow that leads the company or leads the platoon. And then I was advanced into a lance sergeant position, and this fellow is the guide when the whole company goes on marching expeditions and things like that. So I did get along well in the Army. I did adapt well. I had no real difficulties, but there is always stress involved when you're in the military, and you can see people getting hurt, and the mix of people that you're put with in the military. You know, I was a small town boy, and there were people there from Chicago, New York, Detroit, and people that I wouldn't really choose to associate with, but we did associate.
How many hours a day did you have to work?
In basic training, you had to work about 16 hours a day, and all the rest of the time you got to shine your shoes and clean up your gear and do that kind of thing, and then you were allowed to sleep for a very short time. And sometimes there were some, like what you call homework. You had to sit down and do paperwork and turn that in the next day like you were in school.
Was your work a physical strain every day?
Every day, yes. We had what we called PT. The first thing in the morning, we'd arise at 5 o'clock in the morning. We would march to the physical training field, do jumping jacks and sit-ups and push-ups and pull-ups. In fact, when you went to the mess hall, and the mess hall is where you went to eat, they had a chinning bar, and you'd have to do 10 chin-ups to get into the mess hall so you could get something to eat.
Was there something special you did for good luck?
I just tried to obey all the rules, and I tried to avoid conflicts with other soldiers, which is impossible to do because, as I said before, they're a mix of people that you really wouldn't choose to associate with if you had that choice, but you didn't have that choice.
How did people entertain themselves?
Oh, various people chose different ways. Listening to music was one way. Carving wood items was another way. Some people played a lot of cards. Some people rolled dice. Just all kinds of things were available for you to do, except you weren't allowed to go to town and go to nightclubs and do any of those kind of things. You were restricted to the base, and that was where you were at, and you didn't have really the time to go do anything anyhow if you'd been allowed to.
What was your choice of entertainment?
I think that I worked mainly on my equipment to be sure that my equipment was usable and serviceable and would pass inspection every time we had inspection, because that was one thing that they expected: your boots to be shiny, your shave to be clean, your haircut to be short, your weapon, when you used your weapon, it had to be extremely clean. So those were things that I did to keep up, and there were times that I was expected to counsel with some other soldiers who were having trouble adapting, and some that caused us troubles because they'd, especially the southern boys, we call them, like to leave the base and go home and get some moonshine and come back maybe, and then sometimes they didn't come back. And during that time period, if you had one man from the company that was AWOL, then the company was restricted to the company area. And this is an area that would encompass maybe a half an acre, and you couldn't leave that half acre.
Were you ever on leave?
Yes, after I went to the armored school and completed that phase of my training, then each soldier was allowed 30 days leave per year, and we all came home and had a good time, and some of them forgot they were supposed to go back to the Army, but most of us did.
What did you do while you were on leave?
Well, I'd always been an outdoors person, and I know that I must have went hunting if it was hunting season, and I fished and just did the normal things that most young men do.
Did you get to see your family?
Yes, of course you got to see your family when you were on leave. as you graduate from basic training, then if it works out so that you can do that, you can have your family live with you off base. And if you have enough rank, then you can have your family live with you on base. But most of the people who are temporary soldiers, as I thought of myself to be, don't achieve enough rank to have your family live on the base with you.
Was it hard for you to go back once you were on leave?
No, like I said, I adopted to the Army very nicely, and there were lots of things that I really did enjoy about the Army. I didn't have any trouble with taking orders. I didn't have any trouble with giving orders. Many times during the day, there would be many funny things occur with some of these foreign students that we had. We had an instructor that was a warrant officer, and warrant officers in the Army are kind of a different breed. They're not actually commissioned officers, and they're not actually the lower end of soldiers. They're kind of an in-between person, and we had this one warrant officer that just loved classes of second lieutenants, and if he'd catch one kind of dozing off a little bit, he'd bang a eraser off of his head, you know, the kind of erasers that you use on the blackboard. And then if they messed up again, he'd say, "Corporal Osborn, step up here." And Corporal Osborn would take this group of lieutenants or captains or majors or colonels or whatever they might be and give them marching instructions for a half an hour around the buildings where we taught at.
Did you do any traveling while you were in the service?
No, I was never assigned to another location.
Do you recall any particularly humorous or unusual events?
Well, we used to have something we called a blue plate special that we'd put on when visiting dignitaries would come. And this was something that, you know, you would never do in civilian life, but it was something that you were expected to do in the Army. And at the armored school, there were a number of us corporals, and we were expected to hold a target at arm's length and allow this marksman with a handgun to shoot the center out of the target. And that was quite interesting the very first time I did it. You know, if you flinch, then you may make it look like this man who's shooting the pistol is not that good a shot. So you don't flinch. And if you did flinch, he would let you know about it in no uncertain terms. One day when we were having classes, General Ridgway showed up with his driver, and he went inside the classroom and I was outside, and so I was talking to his driver and I said, "General Ridgway always has his picture taken with hand grenades hanging from his belt. Where are his hand grenades?" And he produced a box, and in that box were 3 hand grenades. He said, "There's the general's hand grenades." So that was kind of interesting.
Did you or any others perform pranks?
We did things that you wouldn't normally do. One of the things I remember the company commander said, "We need some materials to build a storage building with." And at another location on Fort Knox, they were busily engaged in building a new barracks, and they had all kinds of materials there to do building with. And we had a roll call at 2 a.m., and you were expected to march over to that area, pick up, or police up, they called it, every piece of equipment that you were able to carry, and that piece of equipment would then be transported back to our company area so that we might use it to build something with. And this encompassed cement blocks and 2x4s and 2x6s and those kind of items. And that was called midnight requisitioning. And I don't think that you're supposed to do that in civilian life.
Do you have any photographs?
Yes, I have a couple I'll show you.
What did you think of officers and fellow soldiers?
Well, I think that by and large, the people who were in the service with me at that time, the soldiers were people like me that, you know, they saw the need to be there. They saw the need to train other people so that they could go into combat and do a good job for the U.S. And not get themselves killed or injured. And as far as officer ranks were concerned, we worked so very closely with people up to bird colonels that those people were kind of everyday people to us, but we still showed them the respect that was due to them, and they treated us good, we treated them good.
Did you ever think that you were treated unfairly?
I never thought that, no.
Did you ever think that you treated anyone else unfairly?
I think that I probably did participate one time when I was in basic training. Like I said, I was the leader of the company, and a fellow had been absent without leave for a couple of weeks, and as I said before, when somebody was AWOL, then the whole company didn't get to leave the company area. And when they came back, at that time it was rather expected that sometime during the first 24 hours that they were back, they would need to go visit the doctor. And this one fellow was from Kentucky, I remember, and he came back, and he was a well-liked person, and he said, I know that I put you guys in trouble. I know what the normal procedure here is, and he said, you just do what you need to do, and like I said, he was a well-liked person, and so he was given the choice of picking out who he would like to fight. And lo and behold, he decided he'd like to fight me, although I had been a boxer before I went into the service, and so I didn't think that was a very wise choice on his part. And we squared off in what's called the latrine, which is a restroom, but it's a much larger than most people's restroom. And I hit him and knocked him down, and he went into the shower area, which is a pretty good-sized area, probably. In that case, the shower area was like 15 by 15. And he stood up and reached up, and trying to help himself up, he put his hand in a soap dish, and his finger went through the soap dish, and I hit him, and he lost half of his finger to the soap dish. And so that took care of the problems that he had created, and he was taken to the hospital, and all the powers that be were then satisfied that what needed to be done had been done.
Did you keep a personal diary while in the service?
No, I think I would have been a little bit too busy to try and do that.
Did you send letters to friends and family frequently?
Well, I did write to my mother and my sister, and my wife at that time lived with me just outside the base. We lived at Muldrow, Kentucky, which is just down the road from Grapevine, Kentucky, and there were some unique names of towns in Kentucky, and we got to see some of those unique towns and some of the unique names.
Could you spell the first town that you said?
Muldrow, M-U-L-D-R-O.
And what was the second one?
Grapevine.
Okay. Do you recall the day your service ended?
Yes, I do. I had been in the separation center, and this is a place that they send you when you're about to be separated from the service. And I might go back just a little ways. I was drafted to serve 2 years active service and 6 years in reserve status. And I had been in the service for 21 months when the Korean War ended, and the company commander called all of us in and said, if you have 21 months or more in service and you would like to be discharged, we're dropping 44,000 men from the Army at this time. And although I liked the Army, I thought I probably liked civilian life better. And so I said, yes, I would like to be separated. And there were lots of us that wanted to be separated from the service. And so the papers were drawn up, and I was transferred to the separation center. And at the time that you're at the separation center, you would think all they'd have to do is do some paperwork that would take a day and you'd be on your way home, but that's not how the Army works. I'm sure that many of you have heard the old Army adage, you hurry up and wait, and that was just about how it was with the separation center. The first day at the separation center, they called us all out and said, we were assigned to different duties, and one of my duties was to assign or to guard prisoners that were doing work. And so we went over to the stockade where the prisoners were kept, and I drew 3 prisoners, and we were supposed to go shovel off a parade field and level it out and do that kind of thing. And I was issued a 12-gauge pump shotgun to guard these prisoners with, and they were knowledgeable that if they ran, they were subject to being shot. Now, none of my prisoners ran, and I didn't have any problems with any of them. But at the same time that I was at the separation center, the next day, we were again assigned prisoner chaser. That's what they called that duty that we had. One of the guys that I knew quite well drew 4 prisoners, and they were to be doing a cleanup around a company area somewhere on the base. And this gentleman was quite religious, and apparently the prisoners became aware of the fact that he was quite religious and God-fearing, and he wasn't like some of the prisoner chasers. He was very civil to them and treated them very nicely. And one of them said to him, he said, I think I understand you better than you think I do, and I think if I ran, you would not shoot me. He said, is that so? And the fellow that was on prisoner guard just didn't answer his question. And so he ran. And the fellow that was on the prisoner chasing detail did not shoot him. And so when that happened, 2 of the other prisoners looked at him and said, well, if you didn't shoot him, you won't shoot us either. And so they ran, and he killed one and crippled the other one. So it was a unique thing, Had those prisoners all escaped, he would have been in the brig himself doing a part of their time. And since he did what he did, he was court-martialed for assault of a prisoner, 2 counts, which, like as I said, one died and the other one was just injured. And he was fined, like $50, because if you do that in the service, then you cannot be held responsible in a civilian court, and you can't be arrested for what happened there in a civilian court. And so that resolved him of any further blame. And it just, things like that happen in military situations, and you don't want them to, but nonetheless, these people, as I said before, are from all walks of life. They've lived all kinds of different lives, and you never know what might be in their mind. There have been times that prisoner guards were attacked by the prisoners, disarmed, and killed themselves. And so it's something that just isn't something you want to do. But after having been at the separation center for about a week, they did my paperwork, and I got up one morning and he said, well, you're free to go, Corporal. Your hitch in the service is done. And so I left there and came back to Marion, Indiana. And I still had 6 years of reserve time to do. And I actually served active duty 21 months and 24 days. And during the time that I was on active reserve duty, there was not another war that came to be that they needed me, because I was still actually in the service. So I didn't have to go, but I was attached to different agencies. I was attached to a gunnery company in Fort Wayne at one time. Another time I was attached to a company in Bluffton, and they just moved you around. I didn't actually go to any meetings or do any drills with any of these people, but had that unit been called up to active duty, then I would have to go with them.
What did you do in the immediate days and weeks following your end of service?
Well, of course, you're pleased to not be in the service anymore, where you have to live that regimented life. And I think I took a week's vacation, and then I went seeking work. And at that time, in the mid-50s, work wasn't that difficult to find, and I think I got a job working at Lindley Box in Marion, Indiana, running a printing press. And I did that for a little while, and then I became involved in selling insurance. and did quite well at selling insurance. It's something that people need, and I felt as though I was doing them a service as well as making a living for myself, and so I did well at that. And then later on down the road, I had always been interested in the outdoors, so I applied to be an Indiana State Conservation Officer, and in 1963 I was accepted to the Indiana Conservation Officers Training School. I went through the training school, which at that time was 6 weeks, was assigned to work in Grant County with an officer who was already here by the name of Lynn Riggs. Worked with him for a period of 3 months, and then I was assigned duties of my own in Miami County as a state conservation officer, and I did that for 30.5 years until I retired. They had a regulation then, and they do now, that says when you turn 60 years of age, you will get to work the rest of that month, and then you are officially retired. And so that happened to me in 1963, and so, or in 93, 63 to 93.
Those friendships while in the service?
Yes, I did. One of the fellows that was drafted with me at the same time, we both went to Fort Knox, Kentucky. His name is Bob Roth. He lives at Fairmount, Indiana. He and I were in basic training, and one day in basic training we were in the gas mask situation, into the gas chamber, I guess it's called there, where you go inside and you take off your gas mask and you sing jingle bells, and then you put your gas mask back on and you attempt to clear the gas out of the gas mask, and then come back outside. It'll lead you outside, but you have to spend so much time inside the gas chamber before you're let out. And as you can imagine, when you're let out of there, you've been subject to tear gas and maybe a slight dose of some other gases, and your eyes are all bloodshot and watery, and your nose is running, and you're a heck of a mess when you come out of there. But Bob Roth and I came out at the same time, and we were sitting there on a grassy knoll just kind of sniffing at each other, and here come a runner from the company area to speak to Bob Roth, and they said that his father had died, and that was a terrible shock to him. And he said, well, what do I need to do to get so I can go home to be with my family during this time? And they said, well, we'll have to look into that. And as it turned out, he was not able to leave Fort Knox, Kentucky, because of the fact that there was a active engagement going on at that time. And so, my heart really went out to him. This was a terribly, terribly hard time for him. Later on, he was assigned to go to Korea, and went there and did a hitch there. And he and I have discussed this many, many times, and how hard that was on him at that time to have his father pass away, and he could not come home to be with his family or go to the funeral. And we talked about some of his experiences in Korea, and they weren't exactly what you'd call fun either.
Have you continued this friendship?
Yes, Bob opened up a furniture store in Fairmount, and we bought some things off of him, and a number of our friends have bought various furniture items off of him. I think about a year ago he decided that he probably had enough of everything, and he just totally retired, and so he doesn't do anything but fish now, I don't think.
Did you join a veterans organization?
Yes, I joined the American Legion. Most veterans, it seems, do join some veterans organization, and when I was a new conservation officer working in Miami County, which Peru is the county seat of Miami County, I was approached by somebody there to join the American Legion, and I had been thinking about it, and so I did join the American Legion, and it was a good experience. Sometimes people think about veterans of being a bunch of rowdy drunks and this kind of thing, and I will admit there are some of the veterans who fall in that category, but by and large they don't fall in that category, and they're nice people interested in benefiting other veterans and benefiting their community. And because I was a state conservation officer and I did that to the very best of my abilities, I was recognized by the American Legion as being the outstanding law enforcement officer in that area for 1972 and 1973. And that was a great honor for me, and I appreciated it very much, and to this day I still belong to the American Legion.
What type of veteran activities have you participated in this organization?
Well, the basic things that I've done as far as veterans are concerned is, they have various kinds of money-raising efforts to benefit veterans hospitals and veterans that are really, really in need of things. And so I participated in some of the fundraising activities there, and that's really about all I've done. I've not held a position of authority in any veterans organizations. I just go there and socialize and eat a meal every now and then, and they really have some very, very nice veterans organizations like the American Legion in Van Buren. They have a really, really nice restaurant there, and it's a good place to go and to take your friends and family.
How has your military experience changed your thinking about war or military in general?
Well, I don't know that it has really changed my opinion. I think, that if the U.S. Needs to go to war to further the things that we consider near and dear and to keep people from being oppressed in other locations, then this is certainly something that needs to be done. And if we need to send our soldiers to locations throughout the world to be sure that what needs to be done is done, we're not the world's policemen. I'm very much aware of that. But there are times that people are so oppressed that they very definitely need help. We have plenty of that help available, and I think the world should be able to avail itself of that help.
Would you encourage military participation for others who are considering it?
Yes, I very much would. From my experience, you can take a young man that's 18 years old or 19 years old or 20 years old, and by having him serve in the military for a period of at least 2 years, he will learn lots of things that he wouldn't have learned otherwise. And it's very easy for me to pick out, when people I see, people who have prior military service and people who do not have any military service. Basically, the people who have prior service are more courteous, seem to be more interested in what's going on in the world. It doesn't make you, 100% better citizen than somebody that hasn't served, but it can certainly help to grow you up and teach you more about the world.
How did your services and experiences affect your life?
Well, as I said, I was an instructor at the Armored School at Fort Knox, and this basically dealt with marksmanship and learning to be proficient with the weapons that you had at your hand. And because I was proficient already, when I tried to become a conservation officer, it was easy for me to qualify in the firearms training part of being a conservation officer. And to that end, I was a weapons instructor, a police training weapons instructor for the state of Indiana for a period of 26 of the 30 years that I served as a conservation officer. And during that time, I was able to help many, many young men to achieve a better shooting record than they ever would have achieved without some training by somebody.
Is there anything you would like to add that we have not covered in this interview?
Well, I think this all goes to patriotism, and you see much more patriotism in people who have served in the military than you do in people who have not served in the military. And I think it's a terrible shame we've attended many basketball games in the gym at Marion High School. I see people who, when they're playing the national anthem, they don't remove their hats. They continue to talk to their neighbors. Just don't show the respect that they should to the American flag or the American people. In fact, I've even kind of helped somebody remove their cap a time or two at the ball game, because this is, just extremely disrespectful as far as I'm concerned, and it does not belong. And I see young people who aren't at all interested in listening to the national anthem or stopping their conversations even for that length of time. And these are things that I think need to be addressed, and more patriotism would go a long, long way towards making America a better place.